Chris Watts and Shanann Watts seemed to be the perfect couple. They met in 2010 through Facebook and quickly fell in love. Their relationship developed rapidly, and they married in November 2012 in a romantic ceremony surrounded by family and friends. Shanann, a charismatic and vivacious woman, worked in sales for a company called Lavelle that sold nutritional supplements and weight management products. She used social media extensively to document her life and family, presenting herself as a successful businesswoman and loving mother. Chris, more quiet and reserved, worked as an operator for the oil and gas company Anadarko Petroleum. He was considered a reliable and diligent employee who took his work seriously and was appreciated by his colleagues. The family lived in a beautiful, spacious house in Frederick, Colorado, which they had bought in 2013 and which became a symbol of their seemingly successful life. Shanann's social media posts showed a happy family life full of laughter, love, and shared activities. She regularly shared photos of family outings, cozy evenings at home, and special moments with her children. Chris often appeared in these posts as the perfect husband and father who loved and supported his family above all else. Shanann was a loving and dedicated mother who was proud of her two daughters, Bella and Celeste. She regularly shared pictures and videos of her girls and their activities together. Bella, the older one, was described as thoughtful and empathetic, while Celeste, affectionately called Cece by everyone, was considered energetic and adventurous. The Watts family seemed harmonious and happy, and their friends and neighbors often described them as the perfect American couple. The family's joy grew even greater when Shanann announced in 2018 that she was pregnant again. The couple was expecting a boy they wanted to name Nico. On social media, Shanann shared her excitement about the pregnancy and showed ultrasound images and updates on the baby's growth. Chris also seemed to welcome the news with joy, and the couple began to make plans for expanding their family. Behind the scenes, however, the reality was different. Despite their seemingly perfect life, the couple was struggling with significant financial difficulties. They had filed for bankruptcy in 2015, with debts of over $400,000, mainly due to credit card debts, student loans, and medical bills. Although they seemed to be recovering from this setback, they continued to struggle to keep their expenses under control. Shanann's sales career at Lavelle was not going as well as she had hoped. Although she presented an image of success and financial prosperity on social media, the reality was less rosy. Many multi-level marketing companies like Lavelle promise high incomes, but few sales partners actually achieve a stable, high income. Shanann worked hard to build her business, but the financial results fell short of her expectations. Chris earned a solid but not excessive salary as an oilfield operator. It was not enough to support the lifestyle they led and presented on social media. The mortgage for their house, car loans, and ongoing expenses for the children increasingly strained the family's budget. The impending birth of a third child promised to exacerbate this financial burden. In addition to the financial problems, relationship issues were increasingly arising. Shanann noticed that Chris was emotionally and physically distancing himself from her and the children. He often seemed absent, even when physically present, and showed less interest in family activities. His attention and affection, which had once been so obvious, seemed to be waning. Shanann began to seriously worry that something was fundamentally wrong in their marriage. She tried to talk to Chris about it, but he avoided conversations or downplayed her concerns. The communication between the couple, which had once been open and loving, became increasingly tense and superficial. In the summer of 2018, Shanann spent several weeks with the children at her parents' home in North Carolina, while Chris stayed in Colorado, allegedly to work. During this time, Shanann noticed that Chris became even more distant. He called less often, sent fewer messages, and seemed to have little interest in what she and the children were doing. Shanann's fears were confirmed when she found evidence that Chris was having an affair. Text messages, unusual credit card charges, and Chris's changed behavior all indicated that he was in a relationship outside of marriage. Shanann was devastated and confronted Chris with her suspicions, but he initially denied everything. What Shanann didn't know was that Chris had indeed begun an affair with a colleague, Nicole Kessinger. The relationship between Chris and Nicole began in June 2018, precisely when Shanann was in North Carolina with the children. Nickel, who worked for a contractor of Anadarko Petroleum, met Chris at work. Initially, Nickel didn't know that Chris was married and had children. He told her that he was in the process of getting divorced and would soon be free. Nickel, who knew nothing of Shanann's pregnancy or the couple's financial difficulties, quickly fell in love with Chris. She saw in him an attractive, caring man who was ready to begin a new chapter in his life. Chris and Nickel spent a lot of time together in the following weeks. They went on dates, attended concerts, and spent intimate moments in Nickel's apartment. For Chris, this new relationship was an escape from his increasingly stressful family life. He began to imagine a future with Nickel, free from financial worries and family obligations. As Chris became more and more entangled in the affair, he began to distance himself more and more from his family. He spent less time at home, was emotionally absent when he was with his family, and showed less and less interest in his children's activities. This change did not go unnoticed by Shanann and her friends. When Shanann returned from North Carolina in early August, she was determined to save the marriage. She tried to talk to Chris, make plans for shared activities, and reintegrate him into family life. She was even willing to forgive him for the affair if he was willing to work on repairing their relationship. But Chris was already too emotionally distant. He had made plans to leave his family and start a new life with Nickel. In his eyes, the marriage had failed, and he saw no way back. Instead of speaking openly with Shanann and seeking a civilized solution, he began to harbor darker thoughts. In the early hours of August 13, 2018, after Shanann had returned from a business trip, there was a fierce confrontation between her and Chris. Shanann had now found solid evidence of Chris's affair and was emotionally at her wit's end. She confronted him directly about the affair and demanded answers and honesty. The argument escalated quickly. Shanann was angry, hurt, and felt betrayed. She threatened Chris that he would never see his children again if he left the family for Nickel. Chris, feeling cornered and seeing no other solution, reacted with uncontrolled anger. In a moment of blind rage, Chris attacked his pregnant wife. He pushed her onto the bed and strangled her with his bare hands. The murder happened quickly, but the consequences would be devastating. After Shanann was lifeless, Chris realized the full extent of his actions. Instead of calling the police or getting help, he decided to cover his tracks and conceal the murder. In this moment of madness, Chris went to his daughter's rooms. Bella and Celeste had been awakened by the noise of the argument and instinctively knew that something terrible had happened. Chris, who had now completely lost control, chose a path from which there was no return. He wrapped Shanann's body in a sheet and carried it down the stairs. Then he brought his two frightened daughters to his car. Bella, the older one, kept asking about her mother, but Chris only gave evasive answers. He placed Shanann's body in the back seat of the car, put the girls in the back seat, and drove off into the darkness. Chris drove to a remote oil field owned by his employer, Anadarko Petroleum. He knew the place well from his work and knew it would be deserted at this early morning hour. Upon arrival, he began the gruesome task of eliminating the traces of his crime. First, Chris dug a shallow grave for Shanann. With his bare hands, he shoveled earth aside and placed his wife's lifeless body in it. Shanann, who was 15 weeks pregnant, was hastily buried, her unborn son Nico with her. Then Chris turned to his daughters. In an act of unimaginable cruelty, he first smothered 3-year-old Celeste. Bella had to watch as her father killed her little sister. Chris lifted Celeste's lifeless body and threw it into one of the oil tanks in the field. Bella, now alone and full of fear, begged her father not to hurt her. She asked what had happened to her mother and sister, and if the same would happen to her. Chris, who seemed to have lost all humanity at this point, ignored his daughter's pleas. He also smothered Bella and threw her body into another oil tank. The brutality and cold-bloodedness of these acts are hard to comprehend. Chris Watts, the man who had once lovingly held his daughters in his arms and read them bedtime stories, had now murdered them in the cruelest way. The oil tanks into which he threw his children's bodies were only 8 inches wide, meaning he had to use force to push the small bodies through the openings. After the crime, Chris returned home. He showered, changed his clothes, and tried to eliminate all traces of his actions. Then he began to stage his lie. He called Shanann's friends, sent her text messages, and pretended not to know where she and the children were. When Shanann's friend, Nicole Atkinson, became concerned because Shanann hadn't shown up for a doctor's appointment and wasn't responding to messages, Chris played the role of the worried husband. He let Nicole into the house to look for Shanann and pretended to be confused and concerned himself. The investigation began immediately after Nicole Atkinson alerted the police. The officers took the case seriously, especially given the fact that 2 young children and a pregnant woman were involved. The police conducted a thorough investigation, closely examining both the Watts' house and Chris himself. From the beginning, the investigators noticed Chris's behavior. While friends, family, and neighbors were in panic and worry, Chris showed little emotion. He seemed nervous and restless, but not in a way one would expect from a concerned husband and father. His statements were vague and contradictory, and he seemed more concerned with protecting himself than helping to search for his family. The police thoroughly searched the Watts' house. They found no signs of a break-in or struggle, which strengthened the suspicion that the family had not disappeared voluntarily. Shanann's purse, phone, and medications were still in the house, which was unusual if she had left voluntarily. The officers also found Shanann's wedding ring on the nightstand, which raised questions as she normally always wore it. During the interviews, Chris gave contradictory statements. He initially claimed that he and Shanann had an emotional discussion before he went to work, and that she had disappeared with the children afterward. But his story changed several times, and he couldn't provide coherent explanations for the inconsistencies. The investigators began to check Chris's alibi and examine his movements on the morning of the disappearance. They spoke with his work colleagues and checked surveillance cameras in the neighborhood. A crucial breakthrough came when a neighbor showed the police footage from his surveillance camera. This showed Chris loading his car in the early morning hours, contradicting his statement that he had gone to work normally. At the same time, investigators examined Chris's phone records and discovered numerous calls and text messages to a number that turned out to be Nicole Kessinger's. When they questioned Nicole, they learned about the affair, which made Chris's motive for the crime clear. The police also used search dogs, which found traces of human remains in the Watts house and in Chris's truck. This evidence, along with the contradictions in Chris's statements and his suspicious behavior, made him the prime suspect. Finally, the police confronted Chris with the incriminating evidence. Under increasing pressure and faced with the overwhelming evidence, Chris broke down. He initially confessed to partial guilt, claiming that Shanann had killed the children and he had then killed her in a fit of rage. But this version didn't hold up long, as further investigations and the discovery of the bodies confirmed his full guilt. Chris was arrested on August 15, 2018, just 2 days after his family's disappearance. The news of his arrest shocked the community and the nation. Many couldn't believe that the man who had asked for information about his missing family in television interviews was actually responsible for their disappearance. During the interrogation, Chris initially tried to minimize his guilt and partially shift the responsibility to Shanann. He claimed he had killed Shanann after seeing her kill the children, but the investigators didn't let up and confronted him with the overwhelming evidence against him. Under the pressure of the interrogation and faced with the overwhelming evidence, Chris finally broke down and confessed to the murder of Shanann and his daughters. He led the investigators to the oil field where he had hidden the bodies. The discovery of the bodies of Bella and Celeste in the oil tanks and Shanann in the shallow grave confirmed the gruesome details of his crime. Chris's confession shocked the nation. The media reported extensively on the case, and public interest was enormous. People across America and beyond couldn't comprehend how a father could be capable of killing his own family in such a cruel way. The case led to numerous discussions about domestic violence, financial stress, and the destructive effects of infidelity. In the days and weeks that followed, more details came to light. It became known that Chris had already taken steps to start his life anew without his family. He had been looking for a new apartment and had made plans for the future with Nicole Kessinger. These revelations reinforced the image of a man who had coldly planned the murder of his family in order to start a new life. In November 2018, Chris Watts stood trial. In a packed courtroom, under the watchful eyes of the media and the public, He pleaded guilty to the murder of his pregnant wife, Shanann, his daughters Bella and Celeste, and the unlawful termination of a pregnancy. The prosecution had originally considered seeking the death penalty, given the severity and cruelty of the crimes. However, after discussions with Shanann's family, it was decided to agree to a plea deal. In exchange for Chris's guilty plea, the prosecution waived the demand for the death penalty. On November 19, 2018, Chris Watts was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, one for each life he had taken. Additionally, he received another 84 years for other charges, including the termination of a pregnancy and the abuse of a corpse. During the trial, the judges and the public showed little sympathy for Chris. The statements from Shanann's family were particularly poignant. They spoke about the unbearable loss and devastation that Chris's actions had caused. Shanann's father, Frank Razuchek, described the pain of losing his daughter and grandchildren and called Chris a coward. The judge called Chris's actions heinous and unimaginable and emphasized that he would remain behind bars for the rest of his life. He told Chris, "You forfeited this right to life when you took these innocent lives." Chris himself barely spoke during the trial. He showed little emotion and offered no explanation for his actions. His lawyer read a brief statement in which Chris said he was remorseful and took full responsibility for his actions. However, many observers felt this statement was insincere and inadequate given the gravity of his crimes. The tragic story of the Watts family is more than just a shocking criminal case. It is a dark mirror of our society that forces us to look deeper and confront uncomfortable truths. Behind the facade of the American dream, the beautiful house, the attractive family, the apparent success, lay a reality of financial difficulties, broken dreams, and destroyed relationships. Chris Watts's incomprehensible act shows in a frightening way how thin the veneer of civilization can be and how quickly a person is capable of unimaginable cruelty. The murder of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste Watts has triggered a wave of compassion and support for victims of domestic violence. Their story has raised awareness of the often invisible dangers in seemingly perfect relationships and inspired people to actively combat domestic violence.